Yeah.
No. I'm here, but I did quite a lot of,
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes. Boa tarde. I'm delighted to welcome you to the keynote session of the 2025 Society for Latin American Studies annual conference. We are thrilled and honored to have Edmundo Paz Soldán here with us to deliver the keynote lecture, and Ed King, my colleague, will introduce Edmundo shortly. First, though, I wanted, in the first place, to thank you all for traveling from far and wide. We have delegates from all parts of the UK here with us today, from across Europe, from Asia, and from across the Americas to be here with us. Oh, I didn't introduce myself. My name's Paul Merchant. I'm a member of staff in the Department of Hispanic, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies here at Bristol, and a member of the organising team. We really hope that you found the conference stimulating so far. I personally have always found SLAS conferences to be characterised both on the one hand by a really exciting breadth of topics covered, and on the other by an atmosphere of openness and warmth. And we really hope that we're managing to create that atmosphere once again here in Bristol. Now, I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling that it is especially important at the moment to preserve spaces for free academic exchange across national borders. Yesterday, I happened to come across the text of a recent speech by Professor Julia Black, who's the president of the British Academy, which is the UK National Academy for Humanities and Social Sciences. And I thought it was very powerful, and so wanted to share just a couple of sentences with you today. In the speech, Professor Black suggests the following response to the current global situation. First and foremost, she says, we must work together. Collaboration is key, because what is needed now is to connect, to cooperate, and to collaborate across disciplines, across institutions, and across countries. She goes on to say that research is, by its very nature, both a national and an international endeavour. It requires the free and flowing exchange of people and ideas across borders. Now, we are, I hope, doing our bit to keep that exchange going here, and especially with our conference theme of alternative futures, to imagine ways in which the world could be different. In that spirit of free and flowing exchange, I'd like to welcome those who are joining us online as well. We're really pleased that we're able to share this part of the conference with you. A small housekeeping note on that front. Those of you online, when we get to the Q&A section after Edmundo's lecture, you're very welcome to share your questions in the chat. We won't, however, be able to hear you. Before I hand over to my colleague, Erika Teichert, who will say a little bit more about practical arrangements for this evening, I just wanted to say a few words of thanks. Thanks to the SLAS committee for all the incredibly helpful advice and support that they have provided over the year that we have been working on putting this conference together. We're also really grateful to the University of Bristol venues and events team, and especially Rose Kingsley-Jones, who have worked really hard to help us bring together many of the logistical arrangements, catering, etc. Thank you to our wonderful team of student ambassadors, Sophie, Sophia, and Rosie, who have quite rightly clocked off at this point, but they've been an enormous help. Thank you to a number of colleagues here at the University of Bristol, too many to name, who helped us with the reviewing of abstracts and the assembling of panels. And on a personal note, I do want to offer enormous thanks to the other members of the conference organisation team, so Carlos Grigsby, Ed King, and Erika Teichert. I can honestly say that it's been an absolute delight to work with you on this. And without further ado, then, I'll hand over to Erika, who's just going to share a few more details on the plans for this evening.
Oh, no, you need that. Hi, everyone. So I'm obviously Erika. It's such a pleasure, really, to have you all here. And I echo everything that Paul said, as I'm sure Carlos and Ed do as well. We are so pleased to have been able to host SLAS at Bristol this year at our university, and have Bristol really act as one of those spaces of free critical engagement that we so desperately need to preserve and protect and defend. I also want to thank Paul, Carlos, and Ned for being just such wonderful colleagues, and just really the collegiality in our department I'm so grateful for, and I hope we've transmitted that to you as well in your visit to us at Bristol. So it's the third time that Bristol has hosted SLAS, actually. We've hosted SLAS before in 1970, 1980, and 2010. So it's a real privilege to have you for a fourth time here in Bristol for the event. So just a couple of another housekeeping things of what's going to happen after the keynote, just so you know what to do, where to go. So after a wonderful keynote, we welcome you all to join us for drinks in the foyer. So that's the area right outside. You're welcome to join us. And for those of you who will be joining us for the conference dinner, we will meet outside the entrance to the arts complex, so that's 7 Woodland Road, and Paul will walk you down to the Emshed, which is a wonderful museum, and that's where we'll be having dinner. So please meet us, so please meet us at 7, that's right, thank you. I forgot the most important bit, didn't I? Outside the arts complex, 7 Woodland Road at 7 to walk down to the harbour side where the museum is. So without further delay, I'm gonna pass now over to Ed, who will introduce our keynote for tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Separate these clinking glasses. It's been driving me mad for the last day. Sorry. So it's a huge privilege to be introducing Edmundo Paz Soldán as our keynote speaker. Edmundo is a distinguished professor of Latin American literature at Cornell University, where he chairs the Romance Studies Department. He's published 14 novels, of which 7 have been translated into other languages, and 6 collections of short stories. He's been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and been shortlisted for or awarded literary prizes in Bolivia, Mexico, and Spain. His fiction is engaged with a broad range of topics, from immigration in his 2011 novel Norte to plant-human communication in 2022's La mirada de las plantas, a fascination with the social, epistemic, and experiential impacts of emerging technologies runs through his work and is a creative line of inquiry that makes it increasingly relevant today. His commitment to speculative aesthetics and narrative makes him, of course, the ideal keynote for our conference theme of alternative futures in Latin America and the Caribbean. On a personal note, his 2001 techno thriller, Sueños Digitales, was the subject of my first academic paper that I ever gave, sometime in the mid-2000s at a SLAS conference. It's an excellent novel, terrible paper, not recorded in any way. Edmundo's last published novel, it's been extremely prolific in the last few years, is Área, protegida, which was published last year in 2024. And his next book of short stories, Las Enloquecidas Estrellas, will come out later this year in October 2025. The title, as you can see, of Edmundo's talk is Narrating Environmental Disasters Today. Over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good evening. Many thanks first to the organizers for inviting me here. Ed, Carlos, Paul, Erica, many thanks for everything. It's been a pleasure to be here, to meet old friends, to make new friends. I also have been attending many panels, and it's great when you go to conferences where they are not talking only about your field. And so I was able to go to, history panels, anthropology panels, of course, literature panels as well, and to see that, we share similar interests. The methodologies might be very different, but I saw lots of things that I learned a lot today, and I hope what I can say will connect with some of your work, some of your research. Okay. Almost 10 years ago, in The Great Derangement, a highly acclaimed essay read as a manifesto on the need for writing more narratives that account for the overwhelming reality of the climate emergency, Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh wrote that climate change casts a much smaller shadow within the landscape of literary fiction than it does even in the public arena. Convincingly, he said, it is as though in the literary imagination, climate change were somehow akin to extraterrestrials or interplanetary travel. The last image is not coincidental because in his essay, Ghosh was talking about serious, quote unquote, serious literary realist fiction as opposed to that genre that has been so subsumed by interplanetary trips and aliens, science fiction. In fact, Ghosh suggested that the occurrence of something very improbable in real life, a tornado, a hurricane, an earthquake, quote unquote, risked banishment to the humbler dwellings that surround the manor house and have now come to be called fantasy, horror, and science fiction. In other words, in The Great Derangement, Ghosh recognized that while realism did not concern itself fully with climate change, speculative fiction did. It could have been interesting if Ghosh had arrived at the obvious corollary, that speculative fiction, as entertaining and escapist as it can be, was always a genre concerned with social and climate changes on a planetary level. And as a result, it deserved to be taken more seriously. But no, Ghosh did not want to make a case for these popular genres, but rather to criticize the shortcoming of serious fiction. In his pages, there was one non-realist exception: the praise he gave to magical realism and its concern with the climate. You know, Garcia Marquez and all the rain all the time, or all the other things that happen in Garcia Marquez and magical realism. Magical realism deserved his attention because since Carpentier and Garcia Marquez, it has been seen as quote-unquote serious fiction, in the same way that the fantastic literature of Borges is. There are other things for which to critique Ghosh. For example, maybe it isn't that realist literature has not been interested in the climate, or in climate change or environmental issues, but rather that our way of approaching the text has not focused on these topics because we did not consider them urgent. To give a personal example, for many years I thought a classic story by Peruvian writer Julio Ramón Ribeiro, Los Gallinazos sin Plumas. In the story, published in 1955, I focused on the abusive dynamic of the grandfather who represented the excesses of capitalism, obsessed with fattening up his pig to the detriment of the health of his grandkids. One year, however, I focused not on the characters, but on the polluted landscape that had always been there in the story, the garbage dump where the grandkids worked, looking for things for their grandfather. The description is striking. When they were near, they sensed a nauseating smell that penetrated into their lungs. Their feet submerged into a pile of feathers, excrement, decomposed or burnt material. Digging in with their hands, they began their exploration. Sometimes, beneath a yellow newspaper, they would find half-eaten carrion. It wasn't that I had not mentioned that before in class. I simply had not fully explored its corners and repercussions. Los Gallinazos sin Plumas is part of a corpus of Latin American texts that environmentalist critic Gisela Hefs calls urban ecocriticism, characterized by their focus on a rhetoric of waste, that is, what is discarded, recycled, and conserved, and that at the same time is linked with a more general problem of environmental destruction and preservation. Hefs goes further and fittingly says that the theme of the garbage subjects, human beings who live near landfills, garbage subjects, quote unquote, of destitute villas seen as extensions of landfills are some of the ways in which Latin America becomes involved in the global biopolitics of bodies in late capitalism. As a result, literature that narrates stories of hidden garbage dumps and those who live off of garbage, of toxic landfills that do not follow industrial hygiene policies in Latin America are key to beginning a specific continental ecocriticism. Once we focus on garbage and residue as symbolic centers of the environmental crisis in Latin America, we begin to see them everywhere, in César Aira, Rafael Pinedo, Verónica Gerber, Mariana Enriquez, Cristina Rivera Garza, Juan Cárdenas, to name a few. Beyond literature, of course, there are many documentaries, movies, paintings, and art installations which tackle this topic. I can name a few, but I'll just mention now Ilha das Flores by the Brazilian Jorge Furtado, one of the most powerful and influential ones. That's from 1989. There are many critics who have embarked on a rereading of the Latin American canon that acknowledges an ecological conscience. looking for the rhetorical tropes and specific discursive configurations of the way in which this problem has been addressed, even in the years in which, paraphrasing anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, we lived without the climate. Those new eco-critical readings of a canon that is not coincidentally dominated by an obsession with landscape, territory, and nature are necessary. Where but an entire subgenre dedicated to the novel of the jungle, the land, the novel of the land, or the novela de la seca in Brazil, la sequía, the traditional Bolivian mining novel so given to descriptions of silicosis, that sickness common among miners who breathe in the polluted air of the mine, could today be understood as a novel of the environmental crisis. It is also necessary to complete the exercise suggested by Rachel Haywood Ferreira of reviewing our literary history and making a retro-labeling of the early versions of speculative fiction that were not considered as such in their moment. As my colleague Caroline Fornoff says, that critical work is necessary to achieve, and I quote her, a more comprehensive understanding of the speculative genre in Latin America, its narrative responsibilities and purpose, and the role of climate in it. This is what Fornoff herself does with her reading of Las Nubes, the story that Mexican modernist writer Amado Nervo published in 1908. Nervo's text begins in this manner. One day, they will arrive on land within many years, many centuries, where there are no longer clouds. Un día llegará para la tierra dentro de muchos años, dentro de muchos siglos, en que ya no habrá nubes. Those white or great apparitions, inconsistent and phantasmagorical, that become rosy at dawn and golden ablaze at dusk, no longer will they, tireless pilgrims, row through the air. The large, beating oceans that today climb to or mow down the continents will have been reduced to miserly Mediterraneans, and in their large basins, that will look like frightening scars. Man will dwell among hybrid flora and fauna. One can see modernist language in the images of the clouds as son rosadas con el alba, rosy at dawn, and doradas a fuego con el crepúsculo, golden, ablaze at dusk. But Nervo's text is also speculative fiction, and he dares imagine, I quote Fornoff, new ways of thinking about the climate, extinction, and the limits of representation. Indeed, Nervo shows us that contemporary ecological anxiety is not new, but rather that modernist cosmopolitanism was also capable of having the planetary consciousness that thinkers like Isabel Stengers or Dipesh Chakrabarty demand of us in order to be able to confront the climate emergency. In Nervo's short text, there is no political critique of the causes of the situation, although it does mention that human beings are in part responsible for the crisis, and I quote, due to incessant filtrations, the water in the depths of the earth, combined with other substances, has other properties and is called something else. Nervo is ahead of the game, since there are few writers who at that time could think that the changes in the environment were not merely due to natural causes. The Anthropocene had begun, but not an anthropogenic way of thinking. In recent decades, from the end of the 19th and on, the most obvious environmental fiction has had a clear connection with political situations or has brought itself to talk more directly about political responsibility. I'm thinking, for example, of the trilogy of the Destrucción de la Cultura, Destruction of Culture, by Argentine Rafael Pinedo, whose best-known novel is Plop from 2004. Like other Argentine fiction of the period, the post-apocalyptic world of Plop could be understood as an answer to the crisis of the neoliberal decade of the 90s, which explodes in 2001. The author imagines a future devastated by the disasters of the present, years of economic adjustment and banking restrictions, the infamous Corralito. That doesn't only happen in Argentina, but throughout the continent, as Andrew Brown has studied in Cyborgs in Latin America, it happens as well. No? The dystopian futures imagined in mid-century Latin American science fiction point to a social critique of the model of neoliberal development, which became hegemonic by then. Back to Plop and garbage. Pinedo's brilliant gesture is finding a great metaphor for the crisis, of the Argentine crisis of the time, in the recyclers who wander around the big Argentine cities digging into garbage and collecting waste to survive, because that is what the characters of the nomadic tribes of the novel are, recyclers of the remains of the disaster. Plop narrates an environmental disaster, an ecological apocalypse in which radiation traverses the air and pollutes the rivers, causes cancer and mutations in humans. The plain where humans live is marked by ecological devastation. They walk on mud between large piles of metal, debris, plastic, rotten clothes, and oxidized cans. Among the garbage piles, they find everything, for the most part, metal and cement. But there is a lot of wood too, and plastic, every kind, and fabric almost always have rotten and devices. No one knows what they are for or what they were for. Later, the narrator insists, the landscape was always the same. Mud, scrap metal, rubble, garbage, a random bush. They live on waste. Natural resources are so scarce that people begin to adore a tree because there is only one found in the region. Plop has never seen a tree, and when he tries to draw one, he cannot. He is unable to imagine it. In the novel, the same form gives account of a scarcity. The regression to a more basic word. Phrases are short and there are no adjectives. Language is transformed. The use of euphemisms of words related to the economy, for example, to use, to recycle, show the ideology, the way the neoliberal economic subject is internalized. In the Latin American consumer society of late capitalism, the hombre basura, garbage man, who lives near garbage dumps and off of garbage is the symbol of the biopolitics of bodies at work. Pinedo makes this idea literal. In Plop, those who are not useful to the group are reciclados, recycled. That is, assassinated. Parts of their body are resignified and used by the survivors. In this way, there is a symbiosis between the landscape and human beings. The remainders of the cities that used to exist are on the ground, and humans collect them and recycle them. But human beings can also become a remainder and be recycled. The name of the main character is not coincidental. Plop, like the sound of mud falling on humans in a dry landscape, is part of what the novel says. Like the material of that dry land, that character ends up joining. As Agustina Gugia says, this work is a clear example of how post-apocalyptic fiction tends to question and corrode the canonical image that literature has constructed about nature, just as happens with water, eternal symbol of life, which is here transformed into an element that burns skin and kills. Not only that, but all of nature is configured as a style seen in the novel, a space of absolute precarity in which bodies circulate. In the most recent speculative fiction, environmental crisis can bring us to different places. In the novel La Muerte y el Meteoro, 2018, Brazilian Joka Reiner's Terron shows us the Amazon transformed into a desert-like passage in which only a few dozen hectares of dying trees about to be scorched by the sun remain, forcing the survivors of an indigenous tribe to become climate refugees and ask for asylum in Mexico. In the just published novel El Monte de las Furias, Uruguayan Fernanda Trias uses a non-human perspective, that of a mountain, to narrate certain sections, compare different time scales, the geological against the human, and find parallels between the exploitation of the land and that of human beings. In the story, Como una casa enloquecida, vaciada de contenido, Argentine Patricio Pron walks through the Anthropocene and shows the multiple connections of garbage with other artifacts throughout millennia. In La Compañía, Mexican Veronica Gerber creates a geological fiction which addresses the slow violence of the pollution of a town, and, as in Pron and Trias, the deep time of the period of extractivism. And I could give you more examples, but the text of Reiner's Terron Trias, Herbert, and Pron situate us before the debate of how to write about the environmental crisis and the Anthropocene. And they are good examples of how a speculative fiction can be more flexible at exploring the causes and consequences of those topics than realist fiction. As Mary Louise Pratt reminds us, the chronotope is a particular configuration of time and space that generates stories through which a society can examine itself. But what happens if we are narrating a story that includes a geological era? That's the challenge. The Anthropocene, Pratt continues, creates a new chronotope with a multipolar time-space configuration. It calls forth previously non-existent meanings for human experience, new possible futures, configurations of desire, action, value, intent. New narrative forms that try to catch our new relationship with the planet emerge naturally, as they do in these authors. We see new forms of reading the landscape, not as detached from humans, I'm quoting Pratt again, not as detached from humans, but as densely populated by ghosts and afterlives of human activity that have been absorbed and enmeshed into the landscape's own generativity. In the anthropogenic chronotope, human and non-human agency are no longer distinguished visually or analytically. Pron's story, and I'm going to talk now about, in a more detailed way, about Patricio Pron. Pron's story is fascinating for the way it decenters the human subject of the narrative and utilizes a geological scale to narrate the story. When I say Pron's story, I just remind this, como una casa enloquecida, vaciada de contenido, which is part of this book. Graciela Esperanza calls this story ficción cósmica, cosmic fiction, which attempts a new brand of realism or materialism, and whose inversion of the chain of metamorphosis equips the structure with cosmopolitan density. Fiction with a hyper-Olympic, now it's myself talking. Fiction with a hyper-Olympic narrator, superior even to the omniscient narrator left to us by the 19th century. This is capable of narrating the world before the appearance of human beings and turning an inanimate thing into the center of the narration. In the first fragment, two albatross lie in the garbage stain of the Atlántico, la mancha de basura del Atlántico. There's a raft of plastic waste, hundreds of square kilometers long, with a density of approximately 200 million fragments of floating garbage per square foot. One more time, the garbage is the symbolic center of the text. Through this time in a place in the ocean, as if to underline Pron's planetary intentions, we are far from the Lima of Los Gallinazos sin plumas. The story, Pron's story, narrates the story of an object, a wig, and its trip through multiple vicissitudes, since before it was a wig, from the organic material that constitutes it to when it has already ceased to be one and forms part of the island of garbage in the Atlantic. The albatross pick at different types of industrial waste, the filter of a vacuum, a tire, until suddenly one chokes on something and ends up letting loose a very fine, quoting, fine thread that comes out of its beak with a hodgepodge of plastic hairs tangled with conchillas and gastric juices. That thread is the only thing that remains of the wig. Afterwards, the story goes back in time, meeting different owners of the wig. First, a drug addict named Lisa, weeks before the albatross found the thread, then the junkie that gave it to her, and the moment he found it in a trash can, then the woman who threw it into the trash, then his mother who also got it out of a trash can, then a porn actress, then the man who bought the wig so that the porn actress could use it, so that then we find ourselves with a heap of plastic bags, women tights, and a sweater that have been turned into a wig through the treatment of the polyacrylonitrile that they contain. Pron chooses to follow the narrative thread of only one of all the materials with which the wig has been made. the synthetic sweater. As we keep going back in time until we get to a derivative of oil, the extraction of that oil, and 50 million years earlier, the story continues, 50 million years earlier, in the initial Eocene, Eoceno, no sé cómo se pronuncia, in the anoxic depths of the Earth, that is devoid of oxygen, and as a result, it's likely that everything that falls into it will turn into oil. So the beginning of sediment, of oil, the beginning of fossil fuels. There is also in the closure a Hyracotherium, a small horse from the initial Eocene with the ability to recall Empedocles and wonder if the world begins with him. Prong narrates the difficulty of telling a story of deep time, a geological pollution that has turned into slow violence. As Matías Oviedo says, the challenge is in confronting two temporalities, one human and the other non-human. Different characters appear in the story, but since time devours them immediately, since many things have occurred even before they came onto the scene, they simply don't have a way of making sense of what happens. If the traditional realist story looks for the meaning of events mainly through the conflict between characters, Prong's speculative story indicates that to narrate on a geological scale, the traditional aims of the story, of the realist story, do not work. It's a paradox. When human beings turn into impersonal geological forces, the individual loses the capacity to affect the course of the story. What we have then, Oviedo suggests, is a series of events that cannot be conceptualized as such, and one process in particular that stands out for its slowness, the formation of the oil that will later be used to produce the wig. The change from organic matter into inorganic matter is undeniably a change of a state, but its slowness makes it impossible to call it an event, for it does not allow witnessing. It is an imperceptible process. How do we narrate an imperceptible process? The uneventfulness of this process stands in the way of its narratability. Fernanda Trias confronts a similar challenge in El Monte de las Furias. The way she resolves it in this story about a woman who guards a mountain that has been taken over by an extractivist company exploiting a quarry is by adopting a perspective focused on the mountain in certain sections. This gives the narrative a mythical breadth, a temporal structure that goes beyond human time. Thus, the mountain, I'm quoting her, thus the mountain devours animals, and those animals have parasites. But for the mountain, human beings are also parasites. There is not only comparison through physical dimensions, but also through the measurement of time. And I quote her, "Men are made of fear. The mountain knows this. While it is made of time, the woman awakens, the moon sleeps. They are like an exhalation. The mountain knows itself to be eternal, though it too will die one day." Although in Trias' novel, the narrator is a recognizable character from whom meaning and psychology can be drawn, in the mountain's perspective, human beings are also impersonal geological forces. This impersonality is represented through the erasure of names and the simplification of their story to their extractivist activity. And I quote, "The man manipulates the machine decapitates, cuts, and ravages. The machine annihilates time. When it's done, the man turns off the engine and goes to wash his hands. What is seen in the quarry must remain in the quarry. What is done among men must remain among men." As the ideas about environmental devastation through slow violence and the geological scale needed to narrate the environmental emergency become more familiar and relevant, writers have to be resourceful in order to stay to meet the narrative challenge. A speculative fiction, as seen in Trias' novel and Pron's story, is elastic enough to play with the planetary scale of events, but even so, it struggles to incorporate into the story the geological processes that should be narrated, keeping in mind the deep time in which these geological events, take place. Veronica Gerber, let me start another section. Veronica Gerber is another writer who confronts the environmental disaster on a geological scale, making use of deep time and slow violence. Her narrative strategies are different from Pron's, but also Trias, but also question the traditional forms of narrating and suggest the need of changing the paradigms of writing inherited for the most part from the 19th century. In La Compañía, Gerber offers different approaches to the pollution of a Mexican town caused by a mercury mine. The first part is a rewriting of El Huésped, the most well-known story of Mexican writer Amparo Dávila. The second part of the book is an intent to narrate the story of the mercury mine through scientific academic materials, maps, photographs, and testimonies, and even a story, José Largo, by José Luis Martínez. The two parts are interrelated. Also, this was part of an exhibit. I'm not going to talk about the exhibit that was organized by Veronica Gerber, but just about the book itself. La Compañía can be read like a Gothic horror story about the way the contaminated elements of a mine take over a Mexican town throughout several decades, and how that insidious appropriation is the contemporary chapter of a long extractivist period of capitalism in Latin America, the most explicit version of the Anthropocene in the continent. Veronica Gerber uses various materials and narrative strategies to carry out her project. In the first part of the book, she appropriates a Gothic fantasy story like El Huésped, Gothic fantastic, sorry. The appropriation seems simple. What she does is sustituir a los personajes, substitute the characters, the guest and Guadalupe, in the original story of Amparo Dávila, for the words company instead of guest, and machine instead of Guadalupe. Change the verb tense of the text to the future, and the narrative voice to the second person. So these are the rules, and then, along with the black and white photos of the mine, the town and the debris that provide evidence of the disaster that occurred there, the effect that Gerber achieves is to tell us the story of a domestic invasion. Nunca olvidarás el día en que vino a vivir contigo. Tu marido traerá a la compañía al regreso de un viaje. You'll never forget the day she came to live with you. Your husband will bring the company on the way back from a trip. You won't be able to repress the scream of horror when you see the company for the first time. It will be somber, sinister. The company is completely inoffensive, your husband will say with marked indifference. You'll get used to it. The metaphorical weight of words like la compañía, the company, effectively overtakes the text. Dávila's ambiguous text, in which we never know which invading huésped, guest of the house we're talking about, unfolds one of its possibilities here. Huésped, guest, is the company. It's one form of the hyper object which you know a lot about. That thing that is massively, I'm sitting at Timothy Morton, is massively distributed across time and space in relation to humans and invokes a radically distinct temporality from the temporalities on the human scale that we are used to. The hyper-object is viscous, it sticks to us, and we cannot get away from it, like any radioactive material. It seriously undermines the notion of an elsewhere. Beyond vision is not beyond perception, because if they are buried in the Yucca Mountains, he or she knows that it will seep into the subterranean leather. And where will that mountain be in 24,000 years? This story has a second part in La Compañía, in which we realize what the hyper-object is. Throughout almost 100 fragments, Gerber tells us the story of the mine and its repercussions on the pollution of the town. Sometimes the fragments are purely scientific information. Climate, vegetation, and hydrography. The climate in the region is mainly dry and extreme, with elevated temperatures up to 36 degrees on average from May to July. Other times, the narrator gives us details on the story, like how between 1935 and 1936, they discovered the deposit that gave way to the stripping of the mercury mine, and the news of how the deposit was a rich seam of cinnabar with a high mercury content that dispersed quickly across the region. Veronica Gerber tells us the ups and downs of the mine according to the price of mercury in the international market. Little by little, she mentions disturbing news like the suicide of a miner or the fact that some show symptoms of mercury intoxication. Fragment 41 is short. The mercury stays in the environment. It causes kidney failure and dementia when intoxication is high. There comes a moment when it causes mental damage. Around the 80s, she mentions that the mine closed definitely because of reports from the health sector. One day, people in the town began to have cephaleas, children and adults, and aside from the headaches, their noses were bleeding. In fragment 85, the narrator says, they would say that in the mines of El Nuevo Mercurio, there were spirits, small green spirits. I dared ask my uncle it a few times, and he responded with fear. I don't remember, he would say. I think they were already very intoxicated and were beginning to see things. In the middle of that landscape of slow geological violence, Gerber includes other details that complete the picture. On one hand, there are rumors of the presence of nuclear waste in Nuevo Mercurio. On the other, the references that frequent meteorites have fallen near the site. Between the nuclear radiation and the presence of alien material in the environment, it's implied that there are various possible forms that the pollution of a place could take on. But Gerber notes a more familiar enemy. I quote, all Latin American governments have promoted the expansion of extractive activities as a measure for stimulating economic growth and sustaining public finances, irrespective of their political, ideological orientation. Her conclusion is similar to that of Rainer Sterron in La Muerte y el Meteoro. The Amazonian indigenous people turned into climate refugees. I forgot to translate this. Venían siendo perseguidos con determinación tanto por el Estado como por sus agentes exterminadores. Mineros en busca de oro, madereros, terratenientes y sus secuaces habituales, militares y funcionarios gubernamentales. La compañía mentions that after the pollution was discovered, the inspection found in the mine barrels with, again, polychlorinated biphenyl, PCBs, compounds produced by Monsanto that, once free, cause immediate adverse effects or delayed effects in the environment through bioaccumulation and or delayed toxic effects in the environment. More recent investigations have concluded that PCBs are carcinogens. Due to the lack of environmental laws, the company uses PCBs in the retort vents as it's much cheaper than diesel. Those who live there, not knowing that PCBs are a powerful toxic compound, also used it for the fences and roofs of their houses. Only in the beginning of this century, after much sickness and death, were actions put in place to contain pollution in the town. As a result, community exposure to PCBs continues and has become chronic. La Compañía is a story explicitly about neo-extractivism as the most visible face of the Anthropocene in Latin America. Fragment 91 says, in English, the catchword for this phenomenon is neo-extractivism, where neo signals a certain degree of continuity with historical trends that began with the conquest and colonization of Latin America and Africa 500 years ago. The scale and rhythm of extractive activities have reached unprecedented levels since the turn of the 21st century, as capital escorts the planet in search of speculative and productive investments in the control of overlapping crises: economic, financial, food, environmental. Herbert is not only interested in showing us the incidents surrounding the mercury mine and the pollution of San Jose Nuevo Mercurio over 70 years. She also points out that this is only a chapter of a slow violence that can be amplified until the arrival of the Spaniards to America at the end of the 15th century. Moreover, the actions to stop the contamination of PCBs are not even fully effective. Much of the time, we continue living the outcome of this neo-extractivist history. Herbert shows us that to tell it, a fiction full of characters and dramatic situations might be no longer sufficient. La Compañía opens up to visual elements, speculates over other options, and shows plenty of scientific facts and quotes needed to understand what took place. If writers often hide the research they have done in the narrative itself and turn it into dramatic action so as not to be accused of doing expository or didactic writing, Veronica Herbert suggests that maybe for geological speculative stories on the environmental crisis, it is necessary to amplify the panorama and show the science that underpins the story, not leaving ambiguities regarding who is responsible for the disaster. Laura Heise in Imagining Extinction says something similar, but we can talk about it later. Characters do not disappear, but are diminished in size. The disaster, in the end, affects the entire community and continent. The polluted hyper-object might be invisible, but is no less effective. And I am ending now. Fictions of the Anthropocene, whether environmental or related to the climate, like in Reiner's Terron, Trias, Pron, and Herbert, destabilize the agency of human beings and portray humans as tiny on the long geological scale, or restricted and powerless in relation to the extraordinary things that happen when the environment is affected. It is as if the ordinary time in which dramas between humans occur were out of balance with the geological time of the climate emergency. In the end, as Ming Hyun Song says in Climate Lyricism, it seems like bearing witness was where the main ethical role possible for the characters of these fictions, since in the majority of cases, they are either passive victims of a violence that they do not know is occurring in their community, or they do not have the long-term perspective to understand where the disaster is headed. Yes, the decentering of human beings in these narratives is notable, as is the way the landscape, static in so many fictions, acquires life and a fundamental role in these authors. They make us pay attention to the world in a more meticulous manner. Some pending challenges could be getting the main characters of these narratives to recover greater agency before the overwhelming challenge to which they are subject, and making sure the political blame and responsibility of the environmental crisis doesn't fade away. However, we have to wonder if literature can free us from something, from anything. If confronting the problem and narrating the dislocations of the climate emergency are not already enormous challenges for any writer. In a recent essay, Colombian writer Juan Cárdenas warned of the need in a moment like this, after so much dystopian narratives and that sensation of the slow cancellation of the future, and the words of Mark Fisher, thanks to the neoliberal model, what is needed for the Latin American writer of the present is to help imagine possible futures and construct utopias, understanding utopia lucidly, not as the paradisiacal space where we go to be happy, but as that trash in the middle of the, I am translating, that trash in the middle of the creative process of chemical decomposition, that garbage dump of forms, again, garbage, that can no longer aspire to be original and as a result has no other remedy but to throw itself into the future, to be the form of what is to come. Among this debris, we have to learn to cultivate future pleasure within everyone's reach. Maybe that utopia is within our reach. Writers and artists who believe in the capacity of a speculative fiction to give an account of the immense challenges of the climate environment, of the climate emergency. Many thanks.
Thank you, Edmundo, for that. That's fine. Okay. Thank you, Edmundo, for that broad and thought-provoking. Is the audio fine? Yeah. Talk. I was trying to keep count: Colombian, Uruguayan, Peruvian, Mexican, Brazilian literature, and starting with Amado Nervo and Ribeiro, who I've never thought of as environmental literature, and ending with Fernanda Trias, whose novel came out 3 months ago. Was it Enero, right?
Yeah.
El Monte de las Furias. Also translational talk, because you were reading your translations of, so that, thank you for that. We have about 15 minutes or so for questions. For those of us who are joining us online via the digital sphere, please remember to write in your questions if you have any. And yeah, we have, like I said, about 15 minutes or so, so please
Yeah,
open the
I
floor
wanted to
questions.
expand into Fernanda Trias, but I just read it, so I have not fully processed the novel, and then I realized I already had enough for 45 minutes. But I would like to continue writing about this novel.
Any questions at all? Yeah, there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. In Spanish or English?
Como quieras.
Ok, entonces creo que la pregunta que tenía en mente se relaciona a este proceso casi fantástico que vivimos hace apenas 5 años, que conocimos como la pandemia del coronavirus. Entonces, mi pregunta es, ¿cómo esa pandemia, cómo crees que esa pandemia figura en estas narrativas de la crisis del medio ambiente? Y lo pregunto pensando, porque Edmundo, tú mismo escribiste un libro que se llama Allá afuera hay monstruos, que me pareció casi profético, ¿verdad? Sobre lo que pasó. Pero mi pregunta es cómo esa pandemia, que parece un momento capturado en apenas 2 años, se relaciona con estas cuestiones del deep time y la crisis medioambiental.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Es una muy buena pregunta. Creo que todavía no hemos procesado del todo lo que ha pasado en la pandemia. Creo que necesitamos más perspectiva, más distancia. Creo que ha habido un deseo de hecho, de olvidar la pandemia, de no leer sobre la pandemia. Te puedo decir que cuando yo publiqué la novela, igual mi editor me dijo, creo que te has apurado mucho en sacarla porque ahorita nadie quiere leer sobre la pandemia y quizás en algunos años se la pueda recuperar. Así que yo creo que es parte, hablando de otra cosa, hace poco aquí en la universidad estamos, uno de los puestos que estábamos buscando en nuestra universidad, en Cornell, un puesto de literatura colonial, pero uno de los trabajos que más nos interesó es de una mexicana, Paulina León, que trabaja pandemias, pero desde el siglo XV-XVI, hace medical humanities, hasta el presente. Y a mí me pareció fascinante porque está pensando incluso desde el punto didáctico, que se podía hablar del contexto histórico, pero también para los estudiantes. Muchas veces la pandemia o la han querido olvidar o es un hecho aislado, pero pues tiene una historia de muy larga duración, toda nuestra historia con las plagas y pandemias. Creo que en la ficción van a pasar algunos años. Creo que lo primero que se hizo, me acuerdo que la revista de la Universidad de México comenzó a pedir textos que eran sobre todo diarios de lo que estaba pasando, desde Mariana Enríquez hasta Alejandro Zambra. Todo el mundo tenía un texto que era un trabajo que era sobre todo de no ficción. Creo que la primera respuesta ha venido a partir de las crónicas o de los textos. Está el libro de Joseph Zárate, que también es un cronista peruano muy bueno, que tiene un libro sobre los trabajadores sanitarios que estuvieron ayudando en la pandemia, pero creo que a partir de la ficción creo que todavía nos falta un poco más de perspectiva.
Gracias. Bueno, voy a hacer la pregunta en español. Muchísimas gracias por la presentación. La verdad es que has tocado unos temas, bueno, esa idea de las diferentes formas de narrar la crisis medioambiental haciendo una lectura del pasado, ¿no?, de la tradición literaria en América Latina, es algo de que yo no me canso de contárselo a mis colegas en ecocrítica. Yo quería hacerte una pregunta sobre esa otra forma alternativa de narrar y esa desestabilización de la agencia en tu obra literaria, ¿no? Si esta forma alternativa acaba siendo un tipo de poshumanismo, ¿no?, donde los animales, las plantas cobran agencia o hay hibridización, ¿no? Todo esto que aparece mucho en tus libros, si esa es una de esas alternativas.
Bueno, yo no tengo nada contra lo poshumano. De hecho, que estoy justo dirigiendo una tesis sobre el tema y me interesa mucho. Pero lo que más me interesa es lo que tú acabas de decir, de cómo nos relacionamos con lo no, cómo somos parte de una misma ecología, de un mismo, o sea, nosotros somos los que más le hemos desestabilizado, pero somos parte de una ecología en la que compartimos, no sé, con animales, con plantas, con montañas. Y me interesa, y me parece que es un gran desafío, cómo hacer para narrar esta historia compartida. Y lo digo como autocrítica. Un amigo me dijo una vez, oye, me dijo, tú en tus cuentos no hay ni perros, ni gatos. Me lo dijo en otro contexto, todavía no estamos hablando del antropoceno, pero me dice, claro, a mí me interesaba así. Pedro le dijo a María, a Arturo, que es siempre como historias así de conflictos humanos, siempre humano. Y decía, ¿para qué voy a meter un loro si es que no va a tener una función, no quisiera que tenga una función decorativa, o sea, si no va a tener una función narrativa, ¿para qué voy a meter un loro? Pero ahí el desafío es ahora decir, ¿por qué no incluir un loro dentro de esta historia? ¿Cómo hago para que ese loro sea parte de esa historia? Eso es para mí como en cuanto a mi autocrítica. Ahora, claro, hay escritores que están haciendo cosas que a mí, no voy a decir cómo, pero por ejemplo, cuando enseño a Horacio Quiroga, a mí me encantan las diferentes versiones de Horacio Quiroga en cuanto a su trabajo con de representación de los animales. Pero la que menos me ha interesado tiene una parte que es más antropocénica, digamos, ¿no?, que es los animales que piensan como humanos. Me encuentran cuentos como Yaguaí, por ejemplo, en la que se ve la perspectiva del perro y se cuenta la perspectiva casi como tratando de hablar todo a partir de percepciones. Sé que estamos hablando de ficciones y que obviamente no nos podemos meter en la cabeza de un perro, pero me gustan esos trabajos donde a través de la representación narrativa no tratas de humanizar al animal, ¿no? Por ejemplo, María Espina, el último libro, ¿cómo es? ¿Solo eso hay? ¿Cómo se llama ese libro? Ese para mí va a ser un gran modelo de algo que se puede hacer trabajando a partir de la perspectiva animal desde la ficción sin antropomorfizar. Pero ahora de pronto veo que, claro, digo, quizás yo estoy equivocado porque, bueno, Irene, hay escritoras que respeto muchísimo, ahora están animándose a narrar incluso desde la perspectiva de volcanes, montañas, y digo, claro, al hacer eso inevitablemente los antropomorfizas, y digo, claro, quizás sea inevitable, ¿no? Digo, entonces es un debate que tengo conmigo mismo de cómo narrar estas cosas sin caer en aquello que es parte del problema.
Igual en español. Creo que me ha gustado mucho lo que has mencionado ahora y bueno, toda la exposición también. Y estaba pensando en dos cosas. Si en toda la literatura que has visto hay también voces de indígenas o a autores, escritores, escritoras indígenas, porque esto de, no es la animalización, pero es pensar en lo poshumano, en lo no humano, está presente y ha estado presente en sus mitos, en sus leyendas, ¿no? Y lo otro que está muy conectado a eso es cómo vinculamos esto con, de parte de las ciencias sociales o de lo que está pasando a nivel, creo que histórico, de darle los derechos a los ríos, los derechos a los lagos, ¿no? Y que ya tienen espacios, bueno, derechos en sí mismos, ¿no? Y que hay que defender estos ríos porque son, como le dicen, tienen un ya reconocimiento jurídico, ¿no? Entonces ahí va el tema de la, no sé si personalización o humanización, ¿no? O simplemente es otro ser vivo, pero con reconocimiento jurídico. No sé cómo ves alguna conexión con la literatura o ecoliteratura o ecocrítica.
Sí, bueno, yo doy un curso que se llama Ficciones del Medio Ambiente, y en ese curso, que es un seminario doctoral, pues vemos mucha literatura indígena, y no solamente, o sea, por ejemplo, vemos a David Copenhague, todas las leyendas de, ¿no?, La caída del cielo, que recién usamos la versión en inglés, pero recién la han traducido al español. Todas esas leyendas amazónicas que son como, están hablando de la emergencia climática mucho antes que cualquiera. También, claro, como leyendas guaraníes, hay un montón de leyendas que yo utilizo para este trabajo, para este curso. Y claro, bueno, alguien por ahí en una de las paneles al que fui, estaba citando a Marisol de la Cadena. Marisol de la Cadena, ¿no?, la antropóloga peruana, pues es una de las que más ha hablado sobre el tema de el trabajo como la personería jurídica de los animales, de las montañas, de lo que está ocurriendo en el Ecuador, en Perú, en Bolivia. Creo que está totalmente conectado. Justo un amigo, yo escribí un post sobre una novela que acaba de salir de Rodrigo Bastidas, un colombiano, que se llama Las dimensiones absolutas. Es una novela que es también una historia sobre un volcán. Y me llamó la atención que fue publicada hace un mes, 2 meses después de la novela de Fernanda Trías sobre una montaña. Entonces, yo posteé algo al respecto y alguien me dijo, oye, pero sí, aquí hay un giro geológico en la ficción latinoamericana. Inmediatamente, el concepto ya me gustó. Dije, esto se podría pensar en más cosas, de más textos sobre... Yo estaba más interesado antes en ficciones de como plantas o animales, pero dije, o sea, hay un montón de textos que están saliendo, que están tratando de narrar historias desde la perspectiva de una montaña, de un volcán, y sin duda alguna están conectados a lo que, también a lo que está pasando a través de la cuestión jurídica y de la reflexión antropológica sobre estos temas. Una cosa que sí me llamó bastante la atención hoy, en las mesas a las que he asistido, la reflexión literaria a veces está atrasada con respecto, a veces se adelanta, pero otras veces se está atrasada con respecto a lo que está pasando en la sociología, en la antropología, en la historia, en otros campos, ¿no? Y en este caso creo que, por ejemplo, para mí como escritor, pues tanto David Copenhague como Marisol de la Cadena me ayudan muchísimo a pensar estos temas. Tanto la reflexión de los mitos indígenas como el trabajo de antropólogos que están haciendo bastante sobre este tema.
Relacionado con de lo que estabas hablando ahora, ¿cómo es la relación con el mercado? Porque hay un apetito, ¿no?, por narrar la crisis ecológica. Es también como también se puede celebrar como un experimento formal de una manera quizá un poco menos crítica que de otra manera. está en el aire, ¿no? Hay un apetito por eso. ¿Qué retos éticos, políticos, estéticos ves ahí, si acaso?
Bueno, yo mientras sea, o sea, para mí, si aparece de forma natural, o sea, me parece, claro, es algo que está en el aire y que si te interesa, pues me parece bien. El problema es cuando se convierte en un nicho y que de pronto pues ya aparece ya, ¿no? En algunos años habrá 20 novelas sobre montañas y ahí es que dices, bueno, claro, ya es el mercado actuando, digamos, ¿no? Porque al comienzo pues puedes decir, ¿quién va a querer leer una novela desde una perspectiva de una montaña, digamos? Es como una cosa bastante difícil, ¿no? Lo que tú quieres es, sobre todo, ¿dónde está el drama humano en esta historia, ¿no? Entonces desde el principio digo, como desafío narrativo, no es necesariamente el camino más fácil, ¿no? No sé cómo lo contaría Netflix, digamos, ¿no? Si el mercado es, ¿cómo vas a narrar una historia desde la...? ¿No? Pero claro, para mí yo lo veo más que nada ahorita como un desafío formal. Primero, cómo integrar lo no humano a nuestras historias, y segundo, cómo narrar desde esas perspectivas no humanas, o sea, la perspectiva más formal. Pero pues me imagino que en alguna oficina deben estar pensando cómo hacemos para sacarle provecho a esto, pero eso no es mi trabajo, por suerte.
Genial. Switch to English now. I think now it's about 1:15, so we have about 45 minutes to enjoy some drinks outside and ask more questions to Edmundo if we were too shy to do so now. And then at 7, just outside of the building, Paul will lead you with safety to the dinner venue afterwards.
Muchas gracias.